Hey guys, tonight we're stepping back in time, way back to a medieval European night. Imagine, if you will, the sun dipping below a horizon of thatched roofs and smudged hills, casting long, dancing shadows across a village square that just hours ago was bustling with the clamor of markets and the shouts of children. Now, the sounds are softening. The distant bleating of a sheep, the gentle lowing of a cow, perhaps the soft rustle of straw as a farmer tends to his last chores. You can almost feel the cool evening air settling in, carrying with it the earthy scent of damp soil, wood smoke, and perhaps, if you lean in close enough, a faint whiff of something distinctly As dusk truly takes hold, the world around you becomes a canvas of deepening blues and purples, punctuated only by the flickering glow of scattered hearth fires. There's no electric hum, no distant city lights, just the quiet symphony of a world preparing for rest. Now, you might be thinking, what's for dinner? But tonight, we're not just talking about dinner. We're delving into that, often overlooked, yet utterly fascinating, realm of the midnight snack. Yes, even in the Middle Ages, when life was, let's just say, a bit less convenient, people still felt those late-night rumblings. But their options? Well, you probably wouldn't survive a day trying to recreate their midnight munchies. Forget your perfectly chilled yogurt or your carefully crafted avocado toast. Medieval midnight snacks were a different beast entirely. They were born of necessity, of what was available, and often of a rather surprising ingenuity that might just make your modern pantry seem, well, a little boring. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're up, drop a comment with your location and local time. It's always fascinating to see where everyone is tuning in from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together as we explore what medieval Europeans might have nibbled on when the moon was high and their bellies were just a little less full. You find yourself standing, or perhaps already lounging on a straw mattress, in a dimly lit, drafty room. The main meal of the day, likely eaten earlier in the afternoon, has long since settled, and a new, softer hunger begins to gnaw. This wasn't the ravenous hunger you might feel after a day of intense labor, but a subtle, lingering emptiness, a quiet suggestion from your stomach that perhaps, just perhaps, a little something extra would be rather nice before the long, dark hours of sleep. The medieval day, unlike ours, was often structured around the available light. Work began at dawn, sometimes earlier, and ceased with the setting sun. This meant that the largest meal, dinner, usually occurred somewhere between noon and late afternoon. This timing was practical. It allowed for cooking and eating during daylight hours, conserving precious and expensive lamp oil or candles, and also provided the necessary fuel for the most strenuous part of the day's labor. But as the evening stretched on, with only the flickering light of the hearth or a dim rushlight for illumination, the body's internal clock, or perhaps just the sheer passage of time, would sometimes prompt a need for more sustenance. You might find yourself tucked into your crude bed, listening to the creaks and groans of the timber-framed house around you, and a thought might wander into your sleep-bound mind. I could really go for something right now. This wasn't always a given, of course. For many, especially the poorest, the idea of a midnight snack was an unimaginable luxury. Every scrap of food was carefully accounted for, and often dinner was all there was. You ate what you could, when you could, and then you simply went to sleep, hoping for another meal tomorrow. Historians still argue whether the concept of distinct meal times, as we understand them, even truly existed for the common medieval peasant, or if it was more a continuous process of grazing on what was available. However, for those with even a modest amount of resources, or for those whose work demanded sustained energy, a little something extra might have been a welcome ritual. You wouldn't find a pantry overflowing with choices, mind you, and definitely no microwave. The preparation would be minimal, often involving foods that required no cooking, or perhaps just a warming by the dying embers of the fire. The focus was on practicality, ease, and, most importantly, not disturbing the household, which was likely already deep in slumber. You might tiptoe to a small cupboard, perhaps a niche in the wall, to retrieve whatever simple provisions were at hand. The quiet hum of the night, broken only by the chirping of crickets or the distant hoot of an owl, would be your soundtrack as you pondered your options. This wasn't a culinary adventure. It was a quiet concession to the body's gentle demands. As the last embers glowed in the hearth, casting flickering shadows that danced like sleepy ghosts across the rough-hewn walls, your mind might turn to the practicalities of a late-night bite. For most medieval Europeans, the evening meal, or supper, was typically lighter than dinner. The main meal consumed earlier in the day. Think of it as a pre-bed snack, but one that was often quite substantial by our modern standards, yet still designed not to weigh you down too much before a night of, well, hopefully peaceful slumber. This wasn't about indulgence. It was about efficiency. You needed enough calories to last through the night, especially if you were a peasant who would be rising before dawn for a day of back-breaking labor in the fields. But you also couldn't afford to waste precious fuel on extensive late-night cooking. So, the focus was on foods that were either already prepared, easy to assemble, or quick to warm. Imagine, for instance, a simple hunk of bread, perhaps a dense, dark loaf baked earlier in the day. Bread was the cornerstone of the medieval diet, the constant companion to almost every meal, and the late-night hours were no exception. You might break off a generous piece, its crust still slightly chewy, and its interior soft, if a bit stale. This wasn't the airy, fluffy white bread you find in modern supermarkets. It was a rustic, hearty affair, packed with nutrients and designed to fill you up. Sometimes, if you were lucky, there might be a smear of butter or a dollop of soft cheese to go with it, adding a touch of fat and flavor to the otherwise plain offering. This was practical and economical, two key words that pretty much defined medieval living. The concept of a light meal for the evening was ingrained, partly for economic reasons and partly due to practical dietary advice of the time. Medieval physicians, in their own wisdom, often advised against heavy meals before bed, believing they hindered digestion and could lead to nightmares or other unpleasant ailments. While they didn't have our understanding of metabolism, there's a certain common sense to it, isn't there? No one wants to go to sleep feeling like they've swallowed a bowling ball. So, even for the wealthy, the last meal of the day tended to be less elaborate than the midday feast. You wouldn't find a whole roasted boar being carved up at midnight, no matter how rich you were. A common late-night option, especially for those with access to milk, would be porridge or gruel. These humble, unassuming dishes were the ultimate comfort food of the Middle Ages. Made from various grains like oats, barley, or even coarser flours, boiled with water or milk until thick and creamy. They provided warmth, sustenance, and were incredibly easy to digest. You might stir in a little honey if you were feeling fancy, or perhaps a few dried berries if the harvest had been good. The simmering pot on the hearth, even if it was just keeping warm from earlier, would emit a soft, earthy aroma, gently filling the quiet room. Historians still argue whether some of these late-night gruels were deliberately thin and liquid for ease of consumption, or if their consistency simply varied wildly based on available ingredients and the cook's whim. Another curious tidbit about medieval snacking habits, particularly after sunset, involved the subtle art of reheating without much effort, since fires might be banked or even extinguished to conserve fuel. Many foods were consumed at room temperature or slightly warmed by residual heat. Imagine a small leftover pastry, perhaps filled with a savory meat mixture or a simple fruit compote, gently warmed by being placed near the dying embers of the hearth. This wasn't about achieving a piping hot temperature, but simply taking the chill off to make it more palatable in the cool evening air. It's a bit like taking a cold slice of pizza out of the fridge and letting it sit on the counter for a bit before you eat it. Not ideal, but perfectly acceptable when you're just looking for a quick bite. This method of gentle warming speaks volumes about the pragmatic approach to food consumption when resources, including fuel, were precious. There was no concept of convenience stores or 24-hour diners. Every bite was a planned affair, even if the plan was just to scrounge for what was left. You learn to appreciate the subtle warmth of something that isn't stone cold when the world outside is frigid and dark. And frankly, after a long day of, say, tending to stubborn oxen or endless spinning wool, even a slightly warmed piece of stale bread might feel like a feast. With the sun truly gone and only the occasional flicker from a distant window breaking the inky blackness, your focus would shift to the fireside flavors. Those simple, uncomforting tastes derived from the hearth, even if the fire itself was just a bed of glowing embers. You wouldn't be whipping up a gourmet meal, but rather seeking out ingredients that could be quickly prepared or were already waiting. The common folk, the vast majority of medieval Europeans, relied heavily on what they could grow or forage. This meant their late-night sustenance often consisted of incredibly basic yet filling items. Think about humble root vegetables, a turnip or a carrot, perhaps roasted earlier in the day and now cool, could be gnawed on. They were dense, provided some much-needed vitamins, and required no further preparation. Not exactly exciting, perhaps, but effective when you just need to put something in your stomach. And if you had a small patch of garden, you might even find a stray onion or a leek that could be eaten raw, adding a sharp, invigorating bite to the otherwise bland fare. These were truly the farm-to-bedside snacks of their time, directly from the soil to your sleepy self. Beyond raw vegetables, consider the omnipresent pottage. This was less a specific dish and more a category, a thick, savory stew, often vegetarian, made from whatever vegetables, grains, and pulses were available. It was typically cooked slowly throughout the day in a large cauldron hung over the fire, meaning there would almost always be some left over. Imagine scooping out a ladleful of this lukewarm, hearty mixture, perhaps thick with peas, beans, cabbage, and barley, into a simple wooden bowl. It might not look appetizing by modern standards, but for a medieval peasant, it was pure, unadulterated comfort. It was the original set-it-and-forget-it meal, perfect for a quick, unheated portion before drifting off. Historians still argue whether pottage was truly a staple at every meal, or if its importance varied greatly by region and social class. Some scholars suggest its prevalence is slightly overemphasized in popular understanding. Then there's the role of dried goods. In an age before refrigeration, preservation was key. Dried peas and beans were commonplace, often soaked and boiled for the pottage. But sometimes, if you were feeling peckish, a handful might be parched over the last embers of the fire, giving them a slightly crispy texture. It's like their version of a roasted chickpea snack, only, medieval. And if you happened to live near a coastline or a river, dried fish would be another possibility. A small, salted, and air-dried fish could be broken off and chewed on, providing a burst of protein and, let's be honest, probably a lot of salt. It wouldn't be the most pleasant experience, but it would certainly satisfy a protein craving. These foods were practical, often inexpensive, and required minimal effort to consume. You wouldn't be reaching for a complicated dessert or a fancy cheese board. Instead, it was about utility. You might be lying on your straw mattress, the smell of the banked fire, a comforting presence, and simply reach for a piece of hard cheese that had been stored somewhere cool, or perhaps a piece of cured meat, a valuable commodity, but one that would last for a long time and could be eaten without any fuss. The goal was to quell that subtle hunger without creating a fuss or using up precious resources like light or additional fuel. It was about making do, and making it work in a world where convenience was a concept yet to be invented. And honestly, there's a certain charm to the simplicity, isn't there? No worrying about calories or macros, just, is this going to fill me up enough to sleep? Now, as you continue to settle into the quiet rhythm of the medieval night, let's talk about the bedrock of sustenance for the vast majority, the peasant's pantry. For the common folk, what they ate for a midnight snack, or indeed for any meal, was entirely dependent on what they could cultivate, raise, or occasionally forage from the land. Their pantry wasn't a room full of exotic spices and imported goods. It was more likely a cool, dark corner of their humble dwelling, perhaps a simple chest or a few shelves holding the very basics of survival. The undisputed king of the peasant's pantry was grain. Wheat, barley, rye, and oats formed the backbone of their diet. This grain would be milled into flour, often at the local lord's mill, and then painstakingly transformed into bread, the essential staff of life. So, when that late-night hunger pang hit, a leftover piece of that dense, dark bread was almost certainly the first port of call. It was filling, provided sustained energy, and required no further preparation. You'd simply break off a piece, perhaps dip it in a little water to soften it, and slowly chew the earthy taste of familiar comfort in the dark. It's hard to overstate the importance of bread. It was the ultimate calorie delivery system, often making up 70 to 80% of a peasant's daily caloric intake. Alongside grain, pulses played a crucial role. Lentils, peas, and beans were dried and stored, providing vital protein and fiber throughout the year. These would be soaked and boiled for pottage, as we mentioned, but a handful of dried peas might also serve as a quick, albeit dry, snack. Imagine munching on them, the hard little spheres slowly softening in your mouth. Not exactly a bag of chips, but it did the trick. And then there were vegetables, primarily root vegetables like turnips, parsnips, and carrots, which could be stored in root cellars or simply buried in sand to last through the colder months. Cabbages were also common, often preserved by fermentation into something akin to sauerkraut. These would be added to pottage, but a raw gnawed turnip wasn't out of the question for a late-night bite if nothing else was available. It sounds utterly unappealing to us, but it was pure, unadulterated sustenance. Dairy products, if available, provided another crucial layer of nutrition. Cows, goats, and sheep provided milk, which was often consumed fresh, but more importantly, transformed into cheese and butter. These preserved forms of dairy were far more common in the peasant's pantry than fresh milk, which spoiled quickly. A hard-aged cheese, cut with a simple knife, provided dense calories and fat, perfect for a late-night energy boost. And if you had any leftover curds from cheesemaking, those could be surprisingly refreshing. Historians still argue whether the average peasant had consistent access to dairy beyond certain seasons, or if it was more sporadic, based on their specific land holdings and animal wealth. Meat, for the average peasant, was a rarity rather than a staple. It was largely reserved for feast days, special occasions, or what little could be snared by poaching. But when it was available, it would be heavily preserved through salting or smoking. A small piece of salted pork or dried beef, though tough and incredibly salty, could be a highly prized midnight morsel. It was protein-packed and required no cooking, making it an ideal, albeit luxurious, late-night option for someone looking to quell a serious hunger. You'd likely chew on it for a good long while, making every precious bit last. It's like their version of jerky, but probably a lot less palatable and a lot more, well, medieval. The salt alone would probably make you incredibly thirsty, leading to another medieval beverage, which we'll touch on soon. So, when you imagine that medieval peasant stirring in the dark, their mind turning to a midnight snack, picture not an array of choices, but a careful consideration of the limited, yet vital, provisions stored away. It was a practice in resourcefulness, making every crumb count and appreciating the simple, profound comfort of knowing you had just enough to get you through the long night. While the peasant's pantry painted a picture of humble necessity, for the medieval elite, the noble nibbles after dark were an entirely different affair. Imagine, if you can, trading your hard bread and cold pottage for something far more sumptuous, even in the quiet hours of the night. You, as a wealthy lord or lady, might find yourself stirring in a soft feather bed, not a straw mattress, and a gentle hunger might lead you to a bedside table laden with treats that would make a peasant weep with envy. For the nobility, the concept of a collation, a lighter, often unheated meal taken late in the evening, was quite common. This wasn't about surviving. It was about gentle indulgence and maintaining a certain standard of living, even after the main dinner feast. One of the most common and luxurious items would be fine white bread, a stark contrast to the coarse, dark loaves of the common folk. This bread, made from highly sifted flour, was a symbol of status and wealth. It would be soft, light, and a true delight to the palate, perhaps accompanied by a generous serving of fresh, creamy butter or a rich, soft cheese, varieties far more delicate than the aged, hard cheeses of the peasantry. Then there's the allure of cured meats. While peasants might occasionally gnaw on a piece of salted pork, nobles would have access to a variety of finely prepared, often spiced, cured meats like venison, boar, or even beef. These would be thinly sliced, perhaps arranged artfully, and offered a complex flavor profile that was a world away from simple sustenance. Imagine a sliver of spiced sausage, fragrant with exotic peppercorns and herbs, melting in your mouth as the castle grew quiet around you. This wasn't just food, it was a sensory experience. even in the dim light of a private chamber. And what about something sweet? The nobility had access to the precursors of our modern desserts, albeit in simpler forms. Dried fruits like dates, figs, and raisins, imported from distant lands, would have been precious commodities, offering bursts of intense sweetness. Imagine a handful of plump, sticky dates, their natural sugars, a comforting balm before sleep. Sometimes these fruits would be gently stewed with honey or a touch of sugar, if available and affordable, creating a sweet, warm compote. Historians still argue whether the widespread use of refined sugar truly began to influence noble diets significantly before the later medieval period, or if honey remained the primary sweetener for most. For the very wealthiest, there might even be delicate pastries or tarts baked earlier in the day and served cold. These would be small, intricate creations, perhaps filled with sweetened fruit or a spiced custard. They were a testament to the skill of the castle cook and the abundance of ingredients available. You might also find a dish of marzipan made from ground almonds and sugar, sculpted into various shapes, a truly luxurious and sweet treat that signaled immense wealth. And to wash it all down, forget water or weak ale. A noble's midnight refreshment would likely be a fine wine, perhaps a light, palatable vintage that wouldn't disturb sleep too much, or even a spiced wine, gently heated for a soothing, aromatic experience. Or perhaps a cup of hypocras, a sweet, spiced wine believed to aid digestion and promote sleep. These beverages weren't just about hydration. They were about pleasure and status, serving as a gentle, comforting nightcap. So, while the peasant might dream of a full belly from simple bread, you, as a medieval noble, could quietly indulge in a culinary whisper of luxury, a testament to your place in a world where even the late-night snack was a clear indicator of social standing. As you lie there in your medieval bed, contemplating these differing late-night provisions, one constant would permeate almost every level of society: the ale's embrace. Forget your modern notions of water as the primary beverage. In medieval Europe, clean drinking water was a luxury, often hard to come by, and sometimes downright dangerous. Wells could be contaminated, rivers polluted, and even fresh springs weren't always reliable. So, what was the go-to liquid refreshment, even for a midnight thirst? Yes, ale. Not the strong, potent craft beers of today, but a much weaker, often thin, and incredibly common brew that was consumed by almost everyone, from the youngest child to the oldest elder, throughout the entire day and night. This low-alcohol ale was effectively a form of liquid bread, providing calories and hydration in a safer, fermented form. The brewing process, involving boiling water, killed off many of the harmful bacteria that lurked in untreated water sources. So, reaching for a tankard of ale before bed wasn't about getting tipsy. It was about quenching thirst safely and often adding a little extra sustenance. Imagine you're stirring in the dark, a mild thirst stirring with you. You wouldn't reach for a glass of water from a tap because taps didn't exist. Instead, you might have a small pitcher of ale by your bedside, or perhaps you'd quietly pad out to a communal area where a larger cask was kept. The taste would be earthy, perhaps a little sweet, and undoubtedly a bit hazy, with sediment often settling at the bottom. It was rarely strongly hopped like modern beers, meaning its bitterness was minimal, making it quite palatable, even in large quantities. It was, in essence, the safe alternative to what could be deadly water. Historians still argue Whether the alcohol content of this small ale was truly negligible, or if, over a full day of consumption, it still contributed to a perpetual mild inebriation, subtly affecting daily life. This ubiquitous presence of ale meant it was often consumed with any late-night snack, no matter how humble. A piece of bread and cheese would be washed down with a gulp of ale. Even a leftover bowl of pottage might be chased with this mild brew. It was simply what you drank. For the wealthy, they might have access to clearer, finer ales, or even wine, as we discussed, but the principle remained. Fermented beverages were the safer, more reliable option. There's a subtle humor in this too, isn't there? The idea of children regularly drinking what we'd consider an alcoholic beverage might seem strange, but for them it was just drink. The low alcohol content meant it was more like a calorie-rich, somewhat flavorful soda pop substitute, albeit one that wouldn't fizz. And it was a far cry from the spirits that came much later in history. You wouldn't find anyone sipping a neat whiskey to unwind in the medieval era. It was all about the gentle, pervasive, and surprisingly essential embrace of ale, helping you drift off to sleep, perhaps with a slightly warmer, more contented feeling in your belly than plain water could ever provide. It truly was the medieval nightcap, served without much ceremony, but with immense practical value. As the medieval night deepens around you, and the last sleepy echoes of the day fade, you might cast your mind toward sources of sustenance beyond the immediate confines of the house, the gardens after dark, while much of the day's foraging and harvesting would have been completed by dusk. A quiet rummage through a personal garden patch could yield some surprising and incredibly fresh late-night snacks, especially in warmer months. Imagine creeping out into your small, fenced garden, the air cool and damp with dew. There's no bright electric light, just the faint glow of a moon, perhaps, or the starlight glinting off the leaves. You might be searching for something simple, something that doesn't need cooking, something to gently satisfy that lingering hunger. A ripe cabbage, for instance, while often destined for pottage, a crisp, raw leaf, perhaps dipped in a bit of salt, could offer a refreshing crunch, or perhaps a turnip still in the ground, pulled fresh from the earth, its earthy sweetness a far cry from the often cooked versions. These were the true farm-to-mouth snacks of the era, picked moments before consumption. Even more intriguing, consider the various herbs and wild plants that might have grown in or around a medieval garden. Many herbs were not just for flavoring food or medicine. Some provided edible leaves or roots that could be consumed raw. For example, sorrel, with its tart, lemony taste, could be a refreshing palate cleanser. Or perhaps a handful of nettle leaves, if you knew how to handle them without getting stung, which could be quickly blanched or even chewed raw with care, offering surprising nutrients. This isn't your modern herb garden designed for culinary finesse. It's a practical extension of the pantry, offering immediate, unprocessed sustenance. Historians still argue whether the consumption of raw, wild plants was a common practice for everyone, or primarily a last resort for the very poorest or those with specific medicinal knowledge. Then there are the berries. If it was late summer or early autumn, you might find a few stray berries on a bush in your garden or just beyond its fence. Wild strawberries, raspberries, or blackberries would have been a rare, sweet delight, a burst of natural sugar and freshness that felt like a true luxury. Imagine popping a handful of these tiny, sun-warmed jewels into your mouth. It's a fleeting pleasure, but one that would certainly bring a gentle smile to your sleepy face. These weren't cultivated, perfect berries. They were smaller, more intensely flavored, and often thorny to acquire. The point is, the medieval garden wasn't just a place of cultivation for staple crops. It was a living larder, offering immediate and diverse options for those quiet, late-night cravings. It speaks to a deep connection with the land and an understanding of its rhythms and offerings that we, with our supermarket shelves, have largely lost. You wouldn't be venturing far, not into the deep, dark woods, but just a few steps from your dwelling under the silent gaze of the moon, for a snack as fresh as the night air itself. It's a testament to how every resource, no matter how small or seemingly insignificant, was utilized to its fullest potential to ensure sustenance, even when the rest of the world was fast asleep. As the quiet, medieval night deepened, and perhaps your stomach gave another gentle rumble, you might find yourself contemplating the ultimate act of culinary resourcefulness: leftovers reimagined. In an era where food waste was not an option, every scrap, every morsel was valued and often found a new purpose, even as a midnight snack. This wasn't about simply eating. It was about creatively transforming what remained of earlier meals into something comforting and satisfying. Imagine a chunk of yesterday's tough, perhaps slightly dried out bread. You wouldn't just throw it away. Instead, it might be moistened with a little ale or water, perhaps even gently toasted by holding it near the dying embers of the hearth, softening it into a more palatable form. This softened bread could then be crumbled into a bowl and mixed with a bit of honey or a few berries if they were available, creating a simple, almost pudding-like concoction. It's the medieval equivalent of bread pudding, but far less refined and much more about making do with what's at hand. Consider the ubiquitous pottage we discussed earlier. While often eaten warm, leftover pottage would solidify as it cooled. This thick, congealed mass wasn't discarded. Instead, it could be cut into slices, perhaps even gently fried or warmed on a griddle over the low heat of the coals. This would create a surprisingly firm, yet still nourishing, cake of vegetables and grains. It sounds a bit odd to our modern ears, but for a medieval person, it was a perfectly acceptable way to enjoy a substantial, already prepared snack without much fuss. Think of it as a savory, historical energy bar, packed with slow-release carbohydrates. Historians still argue whether these solidified pottages were truly widespread or more of a regional adaptation to specific cooking practices and available fuel. Even remnants of meat, precious as they were, wouldn't go to waste. If there were any small pieces of leftover roasted or boiled meat from a grander meal, they might be finely chopped and mixed with breadcrumbs or herbs, then formed into small patties and gently warmed. This resourceful approach ensured that even the smallest bit of protein contributed to sustenance. This highlights a key difference between medieval food culture and our own. Scarcity fostered an ingenuity that we rarely need to exercise today. Our leftovers often end up in the bin. Theirs often ended up as tomorrow's quiet meal. And what about the bones? Even those weren't necessarily discarded immediately. A bone with a bit of meat still clinging to it might be gnawed on, or perhaps simmered into a thin broth if a small fire could be revived. This broth, though likely plain, would offer warmth and some nutritional value, making it a soothing, easy-to-digest option for a late-night hunger. It's a reminder that every part of an animal was utilized, not just the prime cuts. So, while you might be stirring in your sleep, pondering what simple comfort could quell that soft hunger, the answer often lay in the creative reimagining of yesterday's feast, ensuring that nothing, absolutely nothing, went to waste in the resourceful world of medieval Europe. As you nestle deeper into your medieval slumber, perhaps that subtle hunger remains, subtly influenced by the time of year. For medieval Europeans, the availability of a midnight snack was heavily dictated by seasonal scarcity, nighttime plenty. Unlike our modern world of year-round produce, their diets were acutely tied to the cycles of planting, growth, and harvests. This meant that what you might grab for a late-night bite in the depths of winter would be vastly different from what was available during the bountiful warmth of summer. During the warmer months, spring and summer, the land was generous. You might, as we've discussed, find fresh herbs or a few stray berries from the garden. Vegetables like cabbages, onions, and carrots, freshly pulled from the earth, would be more readily available, offering crisp, refreshing options that required no cooking. Imagine the sweet, earthy crunch of a freshly picked carrot, still cool from the evening air, a stark contrast to the stored, softer versions of winter. Fruits, too, like apples, pears, or plums, if you were lucky enough to have an orchard nearby, could be picked and eaten raw. These were simple, juicy delights, offering natural sugars and hydration. The plenty of these seasons meant a wider, albeit still basic, array of fresh, uncooked items for late-night grazing. You wouldn't find citrus fruits or bananas, of course, but the local bounty was appreciated. However, as autumn turned to winter, the landscape transformed. The fresh greens withered, the fruit trees stood bare, and the ground hardened with frost. This ushered in a period of intense scarcity for fresh produce. The medieval pantry then relied heavily on preserved foods. This is where those dried peas and beans truly shone, along with grains. A bowl of thick pottage made from these dried staples would become an even more comforting and essential midnight meal. It was dense, warm if reheated, and incredibly filling. A calorie powerhouse to get you through the long, cold night. You might also find yourself nibbling on a piece of salted fish or cured meat, items carefully preserved from the autumn slaughter or summer catches. These were tough, chewy, and intensely flavored, designed for long-term storage rather than immediate gratification. But they provided crucial protein and fat when fresh options were non-existent. The ingenuity of medieval people in preserving food for the lean months is remarkable. Smoked meats, dried fruits, pickled vegetables, and of course, aged cheeses were all critical components of the winter diet. So, your midnight snack in January might be a piece of hard, preserved cheese and some equally hard bread, perhaps softened by dipping it in a little ale or water. It sounds rather unappealing to us, but for them, it was a vital lifeline. Historians still argue about the exact nutritional impact of these heavily preserved, low-variety diets on the general health of the medieval population, especially during periods of prolonged scarcity. The rhythm of the seasons truly dictated not just the main meals, but also the quiet, personal moments of late-night eating. It was a constant dance with nature's bounty and its stark limitations. A reminder that every bite was a gift, hard-won from the earth and carefully preserved for the long stretch until the next harvest. Now, as your medieval night unfolds, and you reflect on the seasonal shifts in available foods, let's turn our attention to the unsung heroes of medieval bedtime snacks, the grains of comfort. These weren't flashy dishes, no, but they were the quiet, steadfast companions that saw people through countless hungry nights. We're talking, of course, about porridge and gruel. Imagine yourself in a simple, dimly lit medieval kitchen. The fire, if not completely out, is reduced to a few glowing embers, radiating a gentle warmth that barely chases away the chill. You're not looking for culinary excitement. You're looking for warmth, fullness, and a soothing transition to sleep. And that's precisely what a bowl of porridge or gruel offered. These were essentially thick porridges made from various milled grains, oats, barley, rye, or even coarse wheat flour, boiled slowly with water, milk, or sometimes thin ale until they reached a thick, comforting consistency. The beauty of porridge was its versatility and its ability to stretch meager supplies. A small amount of grain could be transformed into a surprisingly filling meal. You might stir the mixture with a wooden spoon, watching as the liquid slowly absorbed, thickening into a creamy, almost paste-like substance. The aroma would be earthy, wholesome, and profoundly simple. For the poorest, it might be just grain and water, perhaps with a pinch of salt if they were lucky. For those with a bit more, a splash of milk would make it richer, or a tiny knob of butter stirred in would add a welcome fattiness. It was, in essence, the ultimate comfort food. Warm, bland enough not to upset a sleepy stomach, and deeply nourishing. Historians still argue whether the consistency of gruel was consistently thin and runny, often caricatured as watery prison food, or if it varied widely. In reality, it likely ranged from thin, soupy concoctions to much thicker, almost solid masses, depending on the region, the type of grain, and the specific intent. For a bedtime snack, a thicker version would have been more satisfying. You might eat it directly from the pot, or pour a portion into a simple wooden bowl, letting the residual heat warm your hands as you slowly spooned it into your mouth. There was no rush. The silence of the night encouraged a slow, deliberate consumption. Beyond simple sustenance, there was a psychological comfort to these dishes. They were soft, easy to digest, and warm, all qualities conducive to preparing the body for sleep. It's like how we might crave a warm bowl of oatmeal or soup when we're feeling under the weather, or just want something gentle. The medieval person experienced that same quiet reassurance. It wasn't about complex flavors or elaborate presentation. It was about the fundamental human need for warmth and satisfaction before drifting off. This tradition of consuming grain-based warm foods before sleep has surprisingly deep roots, persisting in various forms even into modern times, a testament to their enduring appeal as quiet, reliable, and utterly comforting bedtime fare. Continuing our nocturnal journey through medieval mealtimes, we arrive at perhaps the most foundational and omnipresent element of the medieval diet: bread, butter, and bedtime. These three seemingly simple words encapsulate a significant portion of what sustained medieval Europeans, especially when that quiet, late-night hunger stirred. Bread, as we've touched upon, was not just food. It was life itself. For the common person, it was typically a coarse, heavy loaf made from whole grains like rye or barley. This wasn't the airy, processed white bread of today. It was dense, chewy, and packed with nutrients. Imagine breaking off a chunk of this bread, its crust firm, its interior, perhaps, still retaining a faint warmth from the day's baking, even if it had been sitting out for hours. It was the ultimate filler, designed to provide sustained energy for a rigorous existence. For a midnight snack, a leftover piece of this bread, perhaps a little stale, was a common go-to. It could be eaten plain, simply gnawed upon, its texture providing a meditative chewiness in the quiet dark. But what if you wanted to elevate this humble offering just a touch? Enter butter. While not as universally available as bread, particularly for the very poorest, butter was a highly valued fat, especially in northern European regions where dairying was common. Imagine spreading a small amount of soft, perhaps slightly salted, butter onto your piece of bread. This simple addition would transform the plain bread into a richer, more satisfying mouthful. The fat content provided extra calories and a comforting mouthfeel, essential for feeling full and settled before sleep. It was a caloric boost, a taste enhancer, and a quiet luxury, all rolled into one. Historians still argue about the precise regional variations in butter consumption, with some suggesting that olive oil was a more prevalent fat source in southern Europe, while butter dominated further north. The act of eating bread and butter before bed wasn't just about nutrition. It was a deeply ingrained ritual. It was simple, didn't require fire, and could be prepared in moments. You might find yourself sitting on the edge of your bed, or perhaps on a small stool by the banked hearth, slowly consuming your portion. The sounds would be minimal. The gentle tearing of bread, the soft scrape of a knife, the quiet chewing. This wasn't a social event. It was a solitary, personal moment of sustenance. This combination of bread and butter also speaks to the pragmatism of medieval life. Both were relatively easy to store for extended periods. Bread, especially the denser varieties, could last for several days, becoming harder but still edible. Butter, often salted, could also be kept without refrigeration for a surprising amount of time in cool, dark places. This made them ideal candidates for a spontaneous, late-night hunger pang. Always at hand, always reliable. So, as you drift off to sleep, envision that medieval person, quietly savoring a piece of wholesome bread, perhaps with a touch of creamy butter, a timeless and comforting ritual to usher in sweet dreams. It was the original toast and butter for winding down, just ... a lot more rugged. As the medieval night unfolds around you and your gentle hunger persists, let's explore another source of potential comfort, albeit one often more fleeting and seasonal. The orchard's offerings. While not a year-round staple for a midnight snack, fresh fruit, when available, would have been a truly refreshing and delightful late-night treat for medieval Europeans. Imagine it's late summer or early autumn. The days are still warm, but the nights are beginning to carry a crisp coolness. You might have an apple tree in your small orchard, or perhaps a pear tree laden with ripening fruit. Unlike the root vegetables and grains that formed the backbone of the diet, fresh fruit was a burst of natural sweetness and juiciness. A ripe apple, for instance, picked directly from the tree, would be crisp, sweet, and incredibly hydrating. You might simply wash it in a bucket of collected rainwater, wipe it on your tunic, and sink your teeth into it. The satisfying crunch, echoing softly in the quiet night. It's a far cry from the perfectly polished, uniformly red apples we see today. These would be smaller, perhaps a bit knobbly, but bursting with unadulterated flavor. Other common orchard fruits included pears, plums, and cherries. These would ripen at different times throughout the warmer months, offering a rotating selection of natural desserts. A handful of sweet, dark cherries, carefully picked to avoid disturbing the sleeping household. would be a delightful burst of flavor. Plums, with their soft, juicy flesh, would also be a welcome change from the more mundane, savory fare. These fruits, being easily digestible and naturally sweet, were perfect for a light, refreshing snack before bed, satisfying a gentle craving without weighing down the stomach. Historians still argue whether medieval people truly understood the concept of fruit serving sizes or simply ate until satisfied, often making the most of a temporary abundance. For those with access to vineyards, grapes would be another luxurious late-night possibility. Imagine plucking a small cluster of ripe grapes from the vine, each orb bursting with sweet tangy juice. Grapes, especially, would have been associated with both pleasure and religious significance, making them a truly special treat. The quiet act of eating them, one by one, would contribute to the calming atmosphere of the night. The seasonal nature of these orchard offerings underscores the medieval reliance on fresh, local produce. There were no refrigerated imports from distant lands. If it wasn't in season locally, you simply didn't have it fresh. This made the moments when fresh fruit was available all the more precious and appreciated. It was a fleeting luxury, a temporary indulgence that punctuated the more consistent diet of grains and preserved foods. So, as you drift towards sleep, picture that medieval person quietly savoring a perfectly ripe apple or a handful of sweet plums, a simple yet profound pleasure in the stillness of the night. It's a reminder that even in a challenging era, there were moments of pure, unadulterated natural delight, perfect for winding down. As your journey into the medieval night continues, with the last whispers of the orchard's bounty fading with the seasons, let's explore another vital and often comforting source of late-night sustenance: dairy dreams. While fresh milk was perishable and thus less common for immediate consumption, the preserved forms of dairy, particularly cheese and curds, played a surprisingly significant role in satisfying those quiet, nocturnal hunger pangs. Imagine a chunk of cheese. This wouldn't be the mass-produced, uniformly mild cheese we know today. Medieval cheeses varied wildly in texture and flavor, from soft, fresh curds to hard-aged, pungent varieties. For a late-night snack, a hard-aged cheese would be ideal. It was easily stored, didn't require refrigeration, and a small piece provided a concentrated burst of calories, fat, and protein. You might simply slice off a piece with a small knife, the effort of cutting a satisfying counterpoint to the quiet of the night. The taste would be robust, perhaps nutty, or even sharp, a complex flavor that lingered pleasantly on the palate. This was a substantial snack designed to provide lasting satisfaction. Historians still argue whether specific cheese-making techniques were universally shared across Europe, or if unique regional variations led to vastly different products. Beyond the aged cheeses, consider fresh curds. If you were part of a household that regularly processed milk into cheese, there would often be leftover curds, the solid part of milk that separates during cheese making. These curds, often soft and somewhat tangy, could be eaten plain. Imagine spooning a handful of these cool, creamy curds into your mouth, a refreshing and easy-to-digest option that felt light yet nourishing. Sometimes, these curds might be mixed with a tiny bit of honey or a few foraged berries, transforming a simple byproduct into a delicate, sweet treat. It's the medieval equivalent of a cottage cheese snack, but without the neat plastic container. And what about the milk itself? while less common for late-night straight consumption due to spoilage. Milk was sometimes gently warmed or soured to make it last longer. A small amount of slightly sour milk, perhaps with a piece of bread dipped in it, could be a simple and accessible midnight snack. For those with access to goats or sheep, their milk would also be utilized in similar ways, offering different flavor profiles, but serving the same fundamental purpose of providing easily digestible fat and protein. It was all about making the most of every animal product available. The quiet act of consuming these dairy products at night speaks to their comfort and practicality. They required minimal preparation, produced little noise, and offered a soothing, gentle form of sustenance. You wouldn't be lighting a fire to cook a steak. You'd be quietly cutting a piece of cheese or spooning out some curds, letting the simple, wholesome flavors settle you into a state of sleepy contentment. So, as you drift deeper into the medieval night, imagine the quiet satisfaction of a medieval European finding peace and sustenance in the humble yet essential world of dairy, a silent dream of contentment. As you continue to relax into the quiet medieval night, the thought might drift into your mind of more soothing concoctions. Beyond the solid fare, medieval Europeans, even for a midnight snack, sometimes turned to herbal remedies and nightcaps, seeking comfort and aid for sleep through the gentle power of plants. This wasn't about strong medicines in our modern sense, but rather simple infusions and brews designed to calm the body and mind. Imagine a soft, earthy aroma wafting through your room. This might be from a simple herbal tea. While not as common as ale, certain herbs were steeped in hot water or even cold water to create a soothing drink. Chamomile, for instance, has been known for its calming properties for centuries, and a gentle chamomile infusion would be a natural choice for someone struggling to drift off. Other herbs, like lemon balm or lavender, were also recognized for their tranquilizing effects and could be used to brew a fragrant, peaceful nightcap. These weren't typically sweetened unless honey was available, making them a pure, unadulterated taste of nature's calming power. It's like their version of sleepy time tea, but without the fancy packaging and with a much more direct connection to the garden. Beyond simple infusions, there were more structured nightcaps, particularly among the wealthier classes. These might involve spiced wines, often referred to as hypocras, which were believed to aid digestion and promote sleep. Wine would be gently heated and infused with a blend of spices like cinnamon, ginger, and cloves, and sweetened with honey or sugar. The warmth and aromatic spices, combined with the mild alcoholic content, would undoubtedly have a soothing effect, helping to lull the drinker into a restful slumber. This was a luxurious and comforting end to the day, a far cry from the plain ale of the common folk. Historians still argue about the exact composition and widespread availability of such spiced wines, as recipes often varied greatly and ingredients were expensive. For a more humble approach, sometimes even specific food items were believed to have sleep-inducing properties. For example, some medieval texts suggest that certain types of lettuces were thought to be soporific, while eating a raw head of lettuce for a midnight snack might not sound appealing to us. If it was believed to bring on sleep, a desperate medieval person might well have tried it. It highlights a fascinating blend of practical observation, folk medicine, and a touch of superstition that permeated their understanding of food and well-being. So, as you listen to the soft sounds of the medieval night, imagine that quiet person, perhaps stirring a simple herbal infusion, or gently sipping a spiced wine, hoping to invite the sweet embrace of sleep. These were the gentle botanical aids, the natural sedatives of their time, offering a subtle, aromatic path to dreamland when a rumbling stomach or an anxious mind threatened to keep them awake. As the medieval night unfolds, and you might consider the quiet comforts of home, a different scenario emerges for those on the move. Traveling troubles, nighttime suppers. For a medieval traveler, whether a merchant, a pilgrim, a soldier, or even a simple messenger, the concept of a midnight snack was often dictated by the harsh realities of the road and the varying hospitality found along the way. You wouldn't have the luxury of your own pantry or garden. Instead, you'd rely on what could be carried, purchased, or sometimes reluctantly accepted. Imagine yourself trudging along a muddy, rutted track as dusk descends, the chill of evening seeping into your bones. Your destination might be a distant town, a monastery, or perhaps just the next miserable wayside in hunger. A constant companion for medieval travelers would undoubtedly be gnawing. When darkness truly fell, stopping to make a fire for cooking was often impractical or too dangerous, particularly if bandits were a concern. So, what was the default for a hungry traveler at night? Dried provisions were paramount. A traveler's pack would almost certainly contain hardtack or ship's biscuit, a brutally dry, unleavened bread baked for extreme longevity. You might break off a piece of this rock-hard biscuit, perhaps softening it by dipping it into a water skin, if the water was clean enough, and often it wasn't, pushing them towards ale or weak wine as a safer alternative. It wasn't enjoyable, but it was calories. Alongside this, dried meat or salted fish would be common. Imagine chewing on a tough, salty strip of jerky. The effort required almost as much as the sustenance it provided. This was pragmatic survival food, designed for endurance, not delight. Historians still argue whether the commonality of these hard, dry foods contributed to specific dental problems in medieval populations. If you were fortunate enough to find an inn, your options might improve slightly, though a late-night meal might still be limited. Inns often served basic, hearty fare that was easy to keep simmering. More pottage, perhaps a bit of stew, or simple bread and cheese. You might arrive exhausted, cold, and simply be grateful for whatever lukewarm sustenance was offered. It certainly wouldn't be a custom menu. The innkeeper wouldn't be firing up the kitchen just for your late arrival. You'd get whatever leftovers were available, or whatever could be quickly assembled. Sometimes, especially if traveling through sparsely populated areas, a traveler might rely on foraging, but this would be dangerous and less productive in the dark. Better to carry a small, precious store of nuts or dried fruit if your means allowed. These would offer a quick burst of energy and some natural sweetness, a brief respite from the relentless blandness of preserved rations. So, as you finally settle, perhaps by a crackling public fire in an inn or simply wrapped in a cloak by the roadside, your midnight snack isn't a choice, but a stark reflection of the arduous and often precarious nature of medieval travel, a testament to pure necessity. As your medieval slumber continues, and you perhaps consider the travails of the road, let's shift our gaze to a place of both strict discipline and surprising provision. The monastery. For monks and nuns, the concept of a midnight snack was strictly governed by their religious rules, creating a fascinating world of monastic munchies. Imagine yourself in a quiet, austere monastic cell. The day's rigorous schedule of prayers, labor, and study has concluded, and silence reigns. Unlike the common folk or even the nobility, monastics lived by specific rules regarding food consumption, which often included periods of fasting and abstinence from certain foods. However, the monastic life was also incredibly demanding, both physically and spiritually, so some provision for sustenance, even after the main meals, was often necessary. The most common midnight snack in a monastery was often referred to as a collation. This term, which later gave us our modern word collation, originated from the practice of reading a collation, a spiritual text, during the evening, after which a light refreshment might be permitted. This wasn't a feast. It was deliberately meager and designed to sustain, not indulge. The primary components would almost invariably be bread and ale. The bread would be the same coarse, wholesome bread served during the day, and the ale would be the small ale, low in alcohol, essential for hydration and some calories. You would quietly consume your portion, perhaps in a common room or even in your cell, maintaining the solemn silence of the night. Historians still argue about the precise caloric content of these monastic diets, with some scholars suggesting they were often more generous than commonly portrayed to sustain heavy labor during periods of strict fasting, such as Lent. The collation might be even more restricted, sometimes consisting only of water and a few pieces of dried bread. However, some monastic orders found ingenious ways to adapt. For instance, fish was often permitted even when meat was forbidden, leading to innovations like the cultivation of fish ponds within monastic grounds. So, a small piece of dried fish might occasionally appear as a late-night protein source. Beyond the staples, some monastic communities with gardens or special dispensations might have had access to other simple provisions, fresh vegetables from their own gardens, perhaps a few boiled root vegetables or some preserved greens could supplement the bread and ale. And if the monastery had an orchard, apples or pears, especially in season, might be allowed as a rare, refreshing treat. The key was simplicity, moderation, and adherence to the rule of the order. There would be no secret stashes of forbidden sweets. Every bite was accounted for. It was a life of discipline, but one that recognized the basic human need for sustenance, even in the quiet hours before dawn. So, as you drift toward sleep, consider the quiet, purposeful consumption within the monastery walls, where even a midnight snack was a spiritual act, leaving the quiet austerity of the monastery behind. Let's turn our attention to the rare moments of joyous extravagance in the medieval night: festival feasts, late-night treats. While most late-night medieval eating was about simple sustenance, there were specific occasions: major religious festivals, royal weddings, triumphant returns from war, when the rules were joyfully, gloriously, and sometimes spectacularly broken. Imagine, if you can, the great hall of a castle or a wealthy manor house. Even after the main feast has officially concluded, the tables, once groaning under the weight of roasted meats, intricate pies, and towering platters of food, might still hold remnants of the day's culinary splendor. The flickering light of hundreds of candles and torches would cast a warm golden glow, and the air would still be thick with the mingled aromas of spices, roasted meats, and sweet wine. Unlike a quiet, individual snack, these late-night treats were extensions of the day's communal revelry, often consumed by those who were simply too enraptured by the festivities to retire. For these rare, special nights, the midnight snack could be almost as elaborate as a small meal. You might find trays of delicate pastries, perhaps filled with fruit and honey, or small spiced cakes that were incredibly expensive to produce. These were not everyday items. They were symbols of wealth and celebration. Imagine picking up a small, flaky tart, its sweetness a delightful counterpoint to the savory richness of the earlier feast. These would be a true indulgence, a sugar rush in an era where refined sugar was a rare and costly commodity, largely reserved for medicinal purposes or high-status displays. Then there were the comfits and sweetmeats. These were essentially nuts, seeds, or spices coated in layers of hardened sugar, the medieval equivalent of candy. They were painstakingly made and visually stunning, often colored with natural dyes. Imagine tiny, jewel-like morsels, a vibrant green from spinach, or a deep red from madder, offered on small silver platters. These were consumed sparingly, savored for their intense sweetness and luxurious texture. Historians still argue whether the primary purpose of these sweet confections was culinary enjoyment or a display of immense wealth and power by the host. Beyond the sweet, there might be leftover portions of finer cured meats or delicate cheeses that hadn't been fully consumed earlier. These would be offered with fine wine, perhaps even a specially imported vintage, rather than common ale. The conversation would be hushed but animated, the laughter soft but genuine as guests lingered, enjoying the warmth, the company, and the lingering flavors of the feast. It was a time of rare, unadulterated indulgence, a stark contrast to the daily grind. So, as you drift off to sleep, envision those rare, magical medieval nights when the ordinary rules of sustenance were suspended, and even a late-night bite was transformed into a precious, unforgettable treat, a sweet echo of grand celebrations that pierced the usual darkness of the medieval world. These were the nights when stomachs were truly full and dreams were undoubtedly very sweet. As your medieval dreamscape gently drifts from grand feasts to quieter household scenes, let's consider a particularly tender aspect of late-night sustenance: children's comfort foods. Even in the often harsh realities of medieval life, parents would undoubtedly have sought to soothe and nourish their young ones, especially when a child woke with a grumbling tummy in the dead of night. The midnight snack for a medieval child wasn't about indulgence, but about gentle comfort and easing them back to sleep. Imagine a small, whimpering sound from a straw-filled cot. A parent, roused from slumber, would instinctively reach for something simple, something easy to digest, and something that wouldn't require lighting a major fire. The go-to would often be a soft, easily chewable form of the ubiquitous bread. This might be a piece of fine white bread for wealthier families, or a softened piece of everyday brown bread for the common folk. It could be dipped in a little warm ale. Remember, a low-alcohol beverage consumed by all. Or perhaps, if available, some milk. This softened bread would be easy for small mouths to manage and gentle on little stomachs. Historians still debate the specific methods of weaning and feeding infants in different medieval regions, and how early solid foods, like softened bread, were introduced. For infants, a very thin gruel or pap would be prepared. This was a liquid or semi-liquid mixture of finely ground grain boiled with water or milk. It was essentially a medieval baby food, designed to be easily swallowed and digested. A mother might keep a small amount warm by the dying embers of the hearth, or quickly reheat a small portion if the fire allowed. The gentle warmth and bland, comforting taste would be perfect for settling a sleepy child. It's like their version of a soothing bottle, but with a lot more historical flair. If the household had access to a cow or goat, fresh milk or slightly soured curds could also be given. These provided vital nutrients for growing children and were easy on a young digestive system. A small wooden cup of milk, perhaps sweetened with a tiny bit of precious honey, would be a rare and cherished treat. The quiet act of a parent cradling their child, offering this simple sustenance in the hushed darkness, speaks volumes about the enduring bond and efforts to provide comfort, even when resources were scarce. Sometimes, if a child was particularly restless or unwell, a small amount of herbal infusion might be offered, such as a weak chamomile tea believed to have calming properties. These were simple, natural remedies, reflecting the folk wisdom of the time. The goal was always to soothe, nourish, and help the child return to the quiet embrace of sleep. So, as you drift further into your dreams, imagine the quiet, tender moments of a medieval parent offering a simple, comforting bite to a child in the dead of night, a universal act of love and care transcending time. Moving beyond the familial comforts, let's explore a more deliberate and often prescribed aspect of medieval late-night eating: medical midnight meals. In an era when medicine was a blend of ancient wisdom, herbal lore, and a good deal of superstition, food was often seen as a direct tool for maintaining health, preventing illness, and even aiding in recovery. This meant that certain foods were specifically recommended or even administered during the night, not just for hunger, but for therapeutic purposes. Imagine you are a medieval physician, or perhaps a concerned family member tending to someone unwell in the quiet hours. The prevailing medical theory, rooted in Greek and Roman humoral theory, posited that the body was composed of 4 humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Illness was believed to be an imbalance of these humors, and diet played a crucial role in restoring balance. Therefore, specific foods were chosen for their perceived qualities: hot or cold, wet or dry, to counteract an imbalance, even at night. For instance, if someone suffered from insomnia or a hot temperament causing restlessness, they might be prescribed foods considered cooling and moistening. This could include a light gruel made with barley, or perhaps a gentle decoction of lettuce, which was believed to have soporific properties. Imagine a very thin, watery barley broth, perhaps unflavored, or with only a tiny pinch of a calming herb offered in a small cup. It wasn't about taste. It was about the desired physiological effect. Historians still argue about the true efficacy of these medieval medical dietary recommendations, often noting that their impact was likely more psychological than physiological. Conversely, for someone suffering from a cold or phlegmatic condition, perhaps a persistent cough or general sluggishness, warming foods would be recommended. This might involve a small portion of spiced wine, perhaps even gently heated, infused with warming spices like ginger or cinnamon, or a small, easily digestible piece of roasted chicken, considered warm and moist, might be offered. The idea was to gently stimulate the body's internal heat and promote digestion, even during rest. Beyond the humors, certain foods were generally considered restorative and easy to digest for the infirm. Light broths made from chicken or thin vegetable stock would be common, offering hydration and gentle nourishment without overburdening a weakened digestive system. These would be sipped slowly in the quiet of the night, a comfort to both the body and the mind. Even a small piece of fine white bread, easily digestible compared to coarser peasant bread, might be prescribed for those recovering from illness, a gentle way to introduce solid food back into the diet. So, as you drift towards sleep, consider the deliberate thought put into these medical midnight meals. It wasn't about curbing a craving, but about a targeted intervention, a quiet act of healing or maintenance through the precise application of food, all within the hushed sanctity of the medieval night. It's a reminder that even in their sleep, people were constantly engaged with the fundamental forces of health and sustenance, guided by the wisdom of medieval medicine. As the medieval night wears on and your mind drifts from the patient's bedside, let's peek behind the scenes at a figure whose skill, or lack thereof, directly impacted these late-night offerings. The cook's quandary. For the medieval cook, whether in a humble village hut or a bustling castle kitchen, preparing any meal, let alone a midnight snack, presented a unique set of challenges far removed from our modern conveniences. Imagine you are that cook. The sun has set, the main dinner service is done, and the great hall is quieting down. Your fire, your primary tool, is slowly dying down to embers, or perhaps even completely out to conserve precious fuel. This immediately creates a significant hurdle. How do you prepare anything hot without a roaring fire, or even a simple gas stove? The answer often involved planning ahead, utilizing residual heat, or resorting to foods that required no cooking at all. You wouldn't be whipping up a fresh batch of bread at midnight. That was a day's work. Historians still argue about the precise divisions of labor within medieval kitchens and how much autonomy a head cook truly had over ingredients and preparation methods. One of the main challenges was storage. With no refrigeration, food spoiled quickly. This meant that any ingredients for a late-night snack had to be either freshly acquired, heavily preserved, or a leftover from earlier in the day that was still safe to consume. Imagine trying to keep meat or fresh dairy from spoiling in a warm kitchen. It was a constant battle against the clock and the elements. You'd be constantly assessing the freshness of ingredients, making swift decisions based on smell and appearance, a far cry from trusting a best buy date. Then there was the issue of light. Cooking in near darkness, by the flickering glow of a single candle or a dim rushlight, was a common reality. Precision was difficult, and accidents, such as burns or cuts, were a constant risk. Imagine trying to slice a piece of hard cheese or break off a portion of tough, dried meat with minimal visibility. It required an innate sense of touch and familiarity with your tools and ingredients. You certainly wouldn't be attempting anything intricate after dark. And finally, the sheer physical labor. Even for a light snack, preparing medieval food was physically demanding. Grinding grains, kneading dough, chopping tough vegetables. These were not quick tasks. So, the cook's quandary at midnight was always about minimizing effort. Leftovers, preserved foods, or items that could be eaten raw were the clear winners. You'd be looking for the path of least resistance, knowing that any extensive preparation would simply be too arduous and disruptive to the quiet of the night. So, as you drift further into the stillness of the medieval night, spare a thought for the cook. Their quiet, often unseen efforts dictated what humble comforts or rare luxuries were available, even for that fleeting, gentle moment of a midnight snack, a testament to their enduring ingenuity in a world utterly devoid of modern convenience. As the medieval night whispers on, and you consider the challenges faced by the cook, let's delve into a more intriguing, often superstitious, aspect of medieval eating. Even for a simple late-night bite, taboos and superstitions. For medieval Europeans, food was not just sustenance. It was intertwined with belief, folklore, and even fears, leading to certain items being avoided or consumed with specific rituals, especially after dark. Imagine the pervasive sense of a world alive with spirits, good and bad, with omens and portents lurking in the shadows. This worldview naturally extended to what one ate, particularly during the vulnerable hours of the night. Certain foods were believed to bring bad luck, invite malevolent spirits, or cause nightmares if consumed before sleep. For instance, while generally consumed, some believed that eating pork late at night could lead to disturbed dreams or ill health, perhaps due to its heavy, fatty nature and the difficulty in preserving it perfectly. This wasn't a universal taboo, but a localized belief that might make you pause before reaching for that leftover piece of bacon. Historians still argue whether these food-related superstitions were genuinely widespread or confined to specific regions and social strata. Then there were the items associated with magical or demonic forces. Foods that were oddly shaped, grew in unusual ways, or had particularly strong, pungent smells might be viewed with suspicion, especially after dark, when the world felt more mysterious. While not necessarily a food, consuming nightshade berries would be a terrifying and fatal mistake, underscoring the dangers of foraging without precise knowledge in the dark. The line between medicinal herb and poisonous plant was sometimes blurred, and the fear of consuming something harmful inadvertently was very real. Another fascinating, albeit less direct, taboo related to the medieval fear of waste. While not a direct food taboo, the strong moral and practical imperative against wasting food meant that throwing away edible items, even for convenience, was unthinkable. This wasn't just practical, it was almost a spiritual sin. So, even if a food was slightly unappealing or a bit past its prime, it would be consumed rather than discarded. This explains why those leftovers, reimagined, were so crucial for late-night sustenance. To waste them would be to invite misfortune, or worse, the judgment of a higher power. Consider also the fear of witchcraft and sorcery. While not directly about food taboos, the belief that food could be used in spells or enchanted to cause harm might make one wary of accepting a late-night offering from an unfamiliar source. You wouldn't want to accidentally ingest a love potion or, worse, a curse, even if it looked like a harmless piece of bread. These were subtle fears, perhaps not explicitly articulated, but certainly underlying the caution with which one might approach a midnight snack, adding another layer of quiet complexity to the simple act of eating in the medieval night. As the medieval night unfolds, and you consider the shadowy realm of food superstitions, let's turn our gaze from the quiet countryside to the burgeoning medieval towns and cities, where a new phenomenon was slowly emerging: urban eats after hours. While not as bustling as modern city centers, medieval towns, particularly larger ones, offered a slightly different array of late-night food options than their rural counterparts, often catering to those who worked long hours or found themselves out after dark. Imagine stepping into a medieval town after sunset. The main gates might be closed, but inside, a few lanterns might still glow from windows, and a murmur of activity, though subdued, could still be heard. For the working class in these towns, the artisans, laborers, and servants, the day often extended well past dusk. This meant a need for accessible food, even after regular meal times had concluded. While no dedicated 24-hour diners existed, rudimentary forms of street food or late-opening vendors sometimes provided a simple, quick solution. Historians still debate the extent of organized street food vending in medieval Europe versus more informal, ad hoc selling. You might stumble upon a small, humble stall near a market square, or simply a window opening onto the street from a baker's or cook's house. Here, the offerings would be incredibly basic and designed for immediate consumption, without the need for utensils or seating. A warm loaf of bread, perhaps freshly baked earlier in the day and still retaining some heat, might be available. This was a staple, and a quick purchase could quell a rumbling stomach on the way home. Sometimes, you might even find a hot pie, typically savory and filled with minced meat or vegetables. These pies, encased in a thick, inedible pastry crust that served as a protective container, were perfect for eating on the go. Imagine biting into a warm, savory pie, the steam rising into the cool night air, a satisfying burst of flavor and warmth. Another common late-night offering in urban centers would be simple pottage or stew, sold by the ladleful from a large cauldron kept simmering over a low fire. This was cheap, filling, and easily consumed. You might stand briefly by the warmth of the stall, slurping down a bowl of hearty vegetable and grain stew, a quick and effective way to get some sustenance before retiring. This was the medieval equivalent of a late-night kebab stand, just with more turnips and less mystery meat. For the thirsty, small taverns might still be open, offering ale or wine to those who lingered. While not strictly food, these beverages provided calories and liquid comfort, often accompanied by a simple chunk of bread or a piece of cheese that could be purchased on the side. The atmosphere would be dim, smoky, and filled with quiet chatter, a social counterpoint to the solitary rural night. So, as you reflect on the diverse ways medieval people sought sustenance, picture the dim glow of a late-night urban stall, offering a practical, unpretentious bite to those navigating the quieter, yet still active, hours of the medieval town. As you continue to journey through the medieval night, leaving the dim glow of urban stalls behind, let's venture into a more primal form of sustenance that sometimes contributed to the late-night plate: hunting for hunger. While organized hunting was largely the privilege of the nobility, and poaching was a dangerous endeavor for peasants, the pursuit of small game sometimes provided an unexpected, albeit rare, supplement to the medieval diet, even for those quiet, after-dark cravings. Imagine yourself as a peasant, perhaps on the fringes of a lord's forest, or simply in an area with abundant wildlife. Your main diet consists of grains and vegetables, and meat is a luxury. But late at night, that gnawing hunger might lead you to consider opportunistic methods of acquiring protein. This wasn't about grand hunts with hounds and horns. It was about traps, snares, and quiet, stealthy movements. A rabbit caught in a simple snare, or a bird trapped by a clever device, could provide a crucial, unexpected source of fresh meat. If successful, preparing this small game for a midnight snack would require ingenuity, especially without a roaring fire. A rabbit or a bird might be quickly cleaned and then roasted over a small, discreet fire built just for the purpose. Perhaps in a secluded spot, or slowly cooked, wrapped in damp clay and buried in hot ashes. This method, though slow, would yield tender meat without much fuss. Imagine the faint, tantalizing smell of roasting meat wafting through the quiet night, a rare and welcome aroma. This was a direct, visceral connection to nature's bounty, far removed from the cultivated fields. Historians still argue about the true prevalence of poaching and small game hunting among the peasantry, with some suggesting it was far more common than official records indicate due to its illicit nature. For those with even less, foraging for smaller creatures might also occur. Snails, for instance, were a surprisingly common food source in some regions and could be collected and prepared. Or perhaps even frogs, if one was desperate and skilled enough to catch them silently in the dark. These weren't considered delicacies by most, but they provided protein and were readily available in certain environments. The act of gathering these quiet nocturnal creatures for sustenance speaks to the deep connection medieval people had with their immediate environment and their ability to extract nourishment from every possible source. The hunting for hunger was a testament to the constant drive for sustenance and the resourcefulness born of necessity. It was a risky business, particularly if you were poaching on a lord's land. But the potential reward of a small, meaty meal could outweigh the fear of punishment. So, as you drift off to sleep, consider the quiet determination of a medieval person venturing into the shadowed landscape, not for sport, but for the fundamental need to fill an empty stomach, even if it meant a peculiar, self-hunted midnight snack. As the medieval night quietly progresses, and you reflect on the ingenuity required for even a small hunt, let's now indulge in a truly delightful, yet often rare, aspect of late-night medieval consumption. Sweet dreams, sweet treats. For the vast majority of medieval Europeans, sugar was an exotic luxury, making true desserts a privilege reserved for the very wealthy or special festival occasions. But when they did appear after dark, they offered a fleeting glimpse into a world of pure, unadulterated pleasure. Imagine you are a noble, perhaps lingering after a feast, or simply feeling a sweet craving. Forget your modern chocolate bars or ice cream. Medieval sweet treats were a different realm entirely, often based on fruit, honey, or very expensive imported sugar. One of the most sought-after forms of sweetness would be marzipan, made from ground almonds mixed with sugar or honey. This paste could be molded into intricate shapes, tiny animals, fruits, or even miniature castles. Imagine a small, perfectly formed marzipan rose, its delicate sweetness melting on your tongue. It wasn't just food, it was edible art, a testament to the wealth and skill of the kitchen. Beyond marzipan, small fruit tarts or pies could be served. These would typically feature seasonal fruits like apples, pears, or berries, cooked down with honey or, for the truly opulent, a touch of precious sugar. The pastry would be rich, made with butter or lard, and the filling would be intensely flavorful. Imagine a small, warm tart, its fruity sweetness a soothing counterpoint to a day of rich, savory foods. These were not large, rustic pies, but delicate, individual portions designed for refined consumption. Historians still argue whether the concept of a distinct dessert course truly existed in medieval dining, or if sweet dishes were simply interspersed throughout the meal. Another form of sweet indulgence would be candied fruits or nuts. Figs, dates, and even orange peel would be slowly cooked in sugar syrup until they were translucent and intensely sweet. Nuts, like almonds or walnuts, might also be candied. Imagine a bite of candied ginger, its fiery sweetness a surprising jolt to the sleepy palate. These were incredibly precious, served in small quantities and savored slowly. a testament to the rarity of refined sugar. Each piece would be a tiny jewel of flavor. And then there were fritters, or small fried pastries, often made from a simple batter and then drizzled with honey or a spiced syrup. These would be lighter and quicker to make than baked goods, and their warmth could be particularly comforting on a cool night. Imagine a small golden fritter, soft on the inside, with a sticky, sweet coating, a simple joy that transcended the practicalities of everyday medieval eating. These sweet treats, however rare, offered a moment of pure sensory delight before the final embrace of sleep, a truly luxurious midnight snack that reminded the privileged few of the sweeter possibilities in their often harsh world. As the medieval night quietly deepens, and you've indulged in thoughts of sweet treats, let's turn our attention to what quenched the thirst that often accompanied any late-night snack: water, wine, and worry. The quality and safety of beverages were paramount in medieval Europe, and the choices made after dark often reflected a careful balance between accessibility, preference, and a healthy dose of caution. Imagine reaching for a drink in the middle of the night. Your first instinct might be water, but in the Middle Ages, this was rarely the safest choice. Public water sources, like wells and rivers, were often contaminated by human and animal waste, making them breeding grounds for disease. Drinking untreated water was a significant risk, so if you were to drink water, it would likely be from a private well you trusted, or drawn and boiled earlier in the day and allowed to cool. Even then, there was always an underlying worry about its purity. Historians still argue about the precise understanding medieval people had of waterborne diseases, and how much their reliance on fermented drinks was driven by this knowledge versus cultural preference. This brings us back to the widespread consumption of ale, even at night. As we've discussed, the brewing process involved boiling the water, effectively sterilizing it. This made ale, even the thin small ale, a far safer and more reliable beverage than untreated water. So, for a midnight thirst, a common person would almost certainly reach for a tankard of ale. It provided hydration, a few calories, and, crucially, peace of mind regarding safety. The slight buzz, if any, from such low-alcohol ale would be negligible, merely contributing to a general sense of relaxation before sleep. For the wealthier classes, wine was the preferred evening beverage. Wine, like ale, benefited from the fermentation process, making it safer to drink than water. Fine wines, especially, would be consumed for pleasure and status, but even cheaper wines served a practical purpose. Imagine sipping a glass of wine by candlelight. Its gentle warmth and comforting taste a pleasant way to wind down. Sometimes, as we've noted, wine would be spiced and heated, becoming a true nightcap designed to soothe and aid digestion. The worry about contaminated water was largely alleviated by these fermented options. But the worry extended beyond just purity. In larger towns, the quality of both water and ale could vary wildly. Unscrupulous brewers might cut corners, leading to poor quality ale that could still cause illness. Traveling also introduced new levels of worry. You couldn't trust every inn's well or cask. Therefore, carrying your own small supply of dried fruit or hard biscuits was a way to mitigate thirst and hunger when unsure about local provisions. The choices made about what to drink after dark were deeply practical, rooted in the daily struggle for health and safety, making the simple act of quenching a midnight thirst a far more complex decision than it is today. As the medieval night begins its slow march towards dawn, and your thoughts drift from the practicalities of medieval beverages, let's consider a subtle but significant shift in how late-night sustenance was consumed beyond the hearth. While communal dining around the central hearth was a hallmark of medieval life, especially for the common folk, the quiet hours of the night often saw a transition to more private, individual snacking, marking a subtle shift towards personal comfort. Imagine the bustling activity around the hearth during the day. This was the heart of the home, where meals were cooked and shared, where stories were told, and warmth was sought. But as the household settled for the night and the fire dwindled to embers, the communal aspect often faded. If you felt a late-night hunger, you wouldn't necessarily regather the family around the dying fire for another meal. Instead, the midnight snack became a more solitary, personal affair. You might quietly retrieve a piece of bread, a chunk of cheese, or a handful of dried fruit and consume it in your own space, perhaps by your bedside or perched on a stool in a quiet corner. This was about satisfying an individual need without disturbing the collective slumber. Historians still debate the evolution of private versus communal eating spaces in medieval dwellings, and how much personal space was truly available to individuals. This transition to private snacking highlights a nascent desire for individual comfort and a subtle break from the rigid communal structures of medieval life. While privacy, as we understand it, was largely non-existent, these quiet moments of late-night eating offered a fleeting sense of personal space and autonomy. You weren't eating because it was time for a meal with everyone else. You were eating because you were hungry on your own terms, in the quiet of your thoughts. It was a small act of self-care in a world that often demanded conformity. The nature of the foods themselves also facilitated this shift. Hard bread, dried meats, and cheeses didn't require communal cooking or elaborate serving. They could be simply taken, consumed, and then tidied away without fuss. There was no clatter of pots and pans, no loud conversation, just the gentle sounds of quiet chewing in the stillness of the room. This absence of ceremony made private, late-night eating a practical and desirable option, even for the nobility. While their collations might be more elaborate, they were often consumed in private chambers rather than the grand hall. This afforded a different kind of privacy, allowing for intimate conversations or quiet reflection as they savored their delicacies. So, whether you were a humble peasant or a powerful lord, the medieval night, with its subdued activity and emphasis on quiet, transformed the act of eating from a public, communal event into a more private, internal experience, a subtle dance between the collective rhythm of the day and the individual needs of the night. As the medieval night finally begins to surrender to the first pale hints of dawn, and the quiet rhythm of our historical journey gently slows, we arrive at a timeless, universal truth: the quiet end of day. Regardless of social status, whether you were a lord or a peasant, a traveler or a monk, there was a fundamental, deeply human need for comfort and sustenance as the long, dark hours approached their close. The medieval midnight snack, in all its varied and humble forms, was ultimately about this primal desire for contentment before the deep, restorative embrace of sleep. Imagine the final quiet moments. The fire has dwindled to cool ashes, the last candle has guttered out, and the only sounds are the gentle snores of those around you, or perhaps the rustle of leaves outside your window. You've satisfied that last whisper of hunger, perhaps with a piece of hard bread, a comforting spoon of gruel, or a rare, sweet dried fruit. The specific food matters less than the feeling it imparts. A sense of being cared for, of having enough, of being prepared for the stillness of the night. This isn't about gourmet delights or elaborate preparation. It's about the quiet satisfaction of a settled stomach and a calm mind. Historians still argue about the true psychological impact of food scarcity on the medieval population, and how much a sense of enough contributed to overall well-being. The medieval night was a vastly different experience from our own. It was a time of true darkness, of quiet, and often of vulnerability. There were no streetlights, no constant hum of electricity, no always-on screens. This amplified the importance of small comforts, making that late-night bite not just about calories, but about psychological security. It was a simple reassurance that, despite the day's labors and uncertainties, you had found a moment of peace and sustenance. You could finally let go, trusting that your body had what it needed to carry you through until the sun and the next meal returned. The slow pace of consumption, necessitated by the food itself and the lack of light, would also contribute to this winding down. There was no hurried gulping, no mindless munching. Each bite was savored, each swallow appreciated, a mindful act that naturally led to a state of calm. It was a quiet ritual performed in the privacy of your thoughts, a moment of profound connection to the basic needs of life. So, as you listen to the last vestiges of our story fading, let yourself feel that familiar pull towards rest. The sounds of the medieval world are now just whispers, the worries of that distant past receding like shadows before the dawn. All that remains is the gentle promise of quiet sleep, just as it was for those medieval souls. Their simple comforts, their resourceful ways, their fundamental need for warmth and nourishment at the quiet end of their day. It all comes down to this: a shared human experience across the centuries. It's a reminder that even in the toughest times, there's always a quiet moment for a little something, a gentle gesture of self-care before the journey into dreams.